On his 50th anniversary of the introduction of the Novus Ordo Missae by Paul VI on April 3rd, 1969, we've assembled to discuss 50 years of problems with the new Mass. Now, as we've seen, there are lots of problems with the new Mass, but unfortunately, those are not the only problems caused by the reforms of the sacraments brought about after the Second Vatican Council. There are, in fact, problems with all the sacraments revised after the Council, and I have been given the ungrateful task to speak to you about them. I am afraid that it will also be an ungrateful task to listen to this sad story. But it's important to look at the truth and try to judge as correctly as possible and as precisely as possible these reforms in the light of tradition. The sacraments are at the very heart of the Church's life, and one of the main reasons for the piteous state of the Catholic Church today is certainly to be found in the changes that were made in the sacraments after the Council. The half a century that has passed since then enables us now to have a certain historical perspective that makes it easier to judge objectively these reforms and discuss the problems with them, in the hope of hastening the day when the authorities in the Church themselves will admit the mistakes that were made and do something about correcting them. A careful analysis of these new sacraments will also enable us to avoid becoming too extreme in our attitude towards these reforms, a tendency which is understandable given the extreme gravity of the situation, but which in fact will only make the situation worse. Some of the faithful, rightly feeling they have been betrayed by their shepherds, have become distrustful of all authority and have taken to judging everything by themselves. Having neither the knowledge nor the grace of state to do this, they pontificate on deep and obscure theological questions and claim to make solemn, infallible statements about things that even the great theologians in the Church have not been able to agree on. The most obvious example of this is the very difficult question of papal heresy and all that goes along with that. But this attitude appears also in this question of the new sacraments, and indeed, as we shall see, these two questions are related. We will attempt to give a calm, objective picture of the problem that will help people not to be carried away by this tendency, a danger that is aggravated greatly by the internet, where people like this seem to make their abode, seeking whom they might devour. In the limited time available, we can obviously not deal in detail with all the 6 other sacraments besides the sacrament of Eucharist, which the other speakers have already treated. We will concentrate our greatest efforts then on the sacrament that is closest to the sacrament of the Eucharist and the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass, that is the sacrament of order. Indeed, as St. Thomas Aquinas explains, all the sacraments are ordered to the sacrament of Eucharist because it contains Christ himself. But this is particularly true of the sacrament of order, since it is by this sacrament that the Eucharist itself is produced or confected, as the theologians say. Before we look at the sacrament of order, however, we will take a quick look at each of the other sacraments and briefly see the problems they present in the light of Catholic teaching. We will begin with the sacrament of baptism, which is called the gate to all the other sacraments, because in order to receive the other sacraments, one must first of all be baptized. We must start by making an important distinction, which will apply also to all the other sacraments we will see later, namely the distinction between the validity of a sacrament and its goodness. This distinction is often made with regard to the new Mass, which, if one simply considers the rite itself, is promulgated by Paul 6th in 1969, is valid, but cannot be considered as good because it fails to express the Catholic doctrine of the Mass, as expressed by the Council of Trent back in the 16th century against the Protestant heresy. Bonum est ex integra causa, malum ex quocunque defectu, as the adage goes. Goodness comes from a cause which lacks nothing. Evil results from one single defect. So in other words, something is good only if it has everything that it should, whereas it is bad if it lacks just one thing that it should have. You may have a beautiful Cadillac with a great engine and all the luxurious accessories you can imagine, but if the brakes don't work, you've got a bad car. Similarly, even though Pope Paul's Novus Ordo Missae may have sufficient elements to be valid, that doesn't make it necessarily a good rite, because the goodness of a Catholic rite of Mass consists in expressing the Catholic doctrine of the Mass. And the new Mass doesn't do that, as the other speakers have explained. Thus, we must conclude that the Novus Ordo Missae is a valid rite, in itself at least, but a bad rite, because it fails to express Catholic doctrine. Now, this distinction applies to all the other sacraments as well. We will have to distinguish between the reforms which affect their validity and those which simply affect their goodness, their adequate expression of Catholic doctrine. We won't have time to see this in detail with regard to all the sacraments, so we can simply state in general that the goodness of all the revised sacraments has been compromised to a certain extent by the reforms because of the spirit, or the animus, as it's called in Latin, that animated the clerics that concocted these new rites. I will leave to the other speakers to describe this spirit with regard to the Mass, and you have all been subjected to it more or less in your parishes, so it isn't necessary to explain it to you at length. Let us just say that this new spirit is ecumenical, not Catholic, secular, not sacred, democratic, not hierarchical, and ambiguous and sentimental, not precise and doctrinal. So we will speak, especially then, about the validity of the sacraments, which is obviously the most important aspect. But we will not leave aside completely the other accessory elements which are not without great practical importance as well, which more than justifies the resolve to avoid these revised sacraments, even if they are valid, and seek to receive the sacraments as they were before the reforms came in. Over the centuries, the Church has slowly developed these rites that expressed her faith with regard to these holy mysteries Christ entrusted to her care, and the sudden rejection of these rites and their substitution by other new ones that came from who knows where has been, no doubt, largely responsible for the dramatic decline of the Church in the last 50 years. So, to begin with baptism, we see that the revised rite has retained the elements necessary to validity, which, as in all the sacraments, are the matter, the form, and the intention of the minister of the sacrament. Unfortunately, in the document promulgating the new rite, the greatest emphasis is placed on the communitarian aspect of baptism, that is, the fact that it incorporates the person baptized into the Church. The essential aspect of baptism, namely that it washes away original sin and bestows sanctifying grace, is not denied, and it's even expressed explicitly once in this document. But it is given an importance which is very secondary. This explains the practice that has become customary in many places of having communal baptisms of whole groups of babies together, even if it means that some children have to wait weeks or even months before getting baptized. This is a logical consequence of the doctrine. If bestowing sanctifying grace is less important than incorporation into the community, well, then you will wait until the community celebration, even if it means leaving the child with original sin and deprived of sanctifying grace for a long time, with the risk of even being excluded from heaven if it happens to die before being baptized, something that happens more often than one might think. A special problem with the new rite of baptism that must be mentioned is the omission of the exorcisms, which were so prominent in the traditional rite. This revision follows from the facile optimism that was so current at the time of the council and after, when people seemed to think that the devil didn't exist anymore, or at least didn't have much influence. This omission no doubt explains, to a certain extent, the great influence the devil has been able to exercise over the past 50 years, with the result that the great percentage of people now are not even baptized at all. Secondly, there's the rite of confirmation. The novelty affecting validity in this case consists chiefly in the permission to use not just olive oil, but any vegetable oil as the matter of the sacrament. Before the council, the common opinion of theologians was that any oil other than olive oil was doubtful matter, but the new rite allowed any sort of oil to be used as the matter. And this is why it is customary in traditional chapels to have confirmation conferred under condition to those who have been confirmed with oil other than olive oil. Another problem with confirmation is the rather common idea that it's not really distinct from the sacrament of baptism. I remember I had a professor in Rome who told me this, that this is what he taught. They think it's simply a complement of the same thing. Now, obviously, if the bishop administering confirmation doesn't think it's a sacred sacrament in its own right, one can have doubts about whether the confirmation that he administers is the sacrament that Christ instituted. Next in line comes the sacrament of confession. Now, here the problem is not so much as of the validity or invalidity of the sacrament, but of its non-existence. People simply don't go to confession anymore. This is largely a result simply of the general change of spirit and doctrine in the church. The seriousness of sin is played down, and the mercy of God is portrayed as a denial of his justice. And so the need for, or even utility of, confession has been made to vanish. Part of this responsibility, however, or the responsibility for this, however, is also due to the revised sacrament, which is pervaded with this same spirit, which logically led the faithful, who are mercilessly logical in such matters, to think that, well, if God's so merciful, then why bother going to confession at all if he forgives already without it? Also, again in this sacrament, there's the intrusion of the communal aspect to the detriment of the personal relationship of the soul with God. This is the matter of what are called these general absolutions. The new rite has three forms: the conventional individual form, a communal form, which Pope Paul VI himself called the preferable form, or the normal way of reconciliation, and thirdly, for special situations, a general absolution without individual confession. Now, this last form obviously quickly became very popular, especially because it was allowed not only in the extreme situations of war and disaster, as was traditionally the case, but even the case of a shortage of priests. Now, as everyone knows, one of the fruits of the council was precisely the great shortage of priests, which allowed, or even was used as a pretext for, the generalization of these general absolutions, which were in vogue for a certain time, until people finally decided that if absolution was that easy, there was no point in even bothering going to the celebration in order to get it. Then comes the sacrament of extreme unction, or rather, as the New Rite calls it, the anointing of the sick. This change in title suffices to manifest the problem with this sacrament, and it's a very grave problem. It affects the very validity of the sacrament. Instead of being an immediate preparation for death, as it was conceived of traditionally, the new sacrament is seen essentially as a means of restoring bodily health. Now listen to Father Bowman, the chairman of the Committee of the Continuing Education of Priests in his diocese, who explains this point very clearly. He writes, "The sacrament of the anointing of the sick should not be a last sacrament any more than baptism, confirmation, matrimony, or holy odors. We used to have some notion that it could effect a forgiveness of sin and, on occasion, might even restore physical health. Today we see the sacrament not as a preparation for death, but as an aid to a more beautiful life, first and immediately on earth." This seriously puts in doubt the very validity of this new rite, since it is essentially something different from what the Church has defined about the sacrament of extreme unction. This was done at the Council of Trent, where it is said that the sacrament of extreme unction has been instituted primarily, quote, "to wipe away sin and the remains of sin," end of quote, and secondarily, to help the sick person attain bodily health when it is expedient for the salvation of the soul, end of quote. And thus the Catechism of this same council states, quote, "This sacrament is to be administered to those only whose malady is such as to excite apprehensions of approaching dissolution," that is, of death, end of quote. Finally, before coming to the sacrament of order, there is the sacrament of marriage. The problem here is not so much in the new rite as in the new doctrine in general about marriage, which obviously has a direct effect on the sacrament of marriage. This is especially so because the ministers of the sacrament of marriage are the spouses themselves, and the intentions of these ministers, upon which depends the validity of the sacrament, directly depends on the conception of these people of what they are doing when they get married. Up until now, it was generally considered that people knew what they were doing when they got married, especially if they were Catholics getting married in the church. But since Vatican II, and especially since Amoris Laetitia, one has to wonder if that still holds true in all cases. Now, this is too large and too difficult a topic to get into here, and we must go on now and address the question of the sacrament of order. The sacrament of order was the first sacrament to be revised after the council, which is a sign of its importance. This was done by Pope Paul VI in the Apostolic Constitution Pontificalis Romani Recognitio on June 18, 1968. Mr. Michael Davies examined this revision in detail in a book entitled The Order of Melchizedek, which was written in 1978 and was one of the first criticisms of the new rite to appear. He limits his treatment to the rite of the ordination of a priest, leaving aside the even more questionable revised rite for the consecration of a bishop, which we will see later. Mr. Davies, a converted Anglican, compares the revised rite of ordination with the Anglican revision of the Catholic rite made by Thomas Cranmer in the 16th century. And he finds a very disturbing similarity. He writes, "Where the rite for ordaining a priest is concerned, the first point to make is that the matter and essential form designated by Pius XII in the document Sacramentum Ordinis remains unchanged. This is a point in favor of the new rite. It is the only point in its favor. The traditional rite of ordination has been remodeled in the most drastic manner, and following the example of Cranmer, this has been achieved principally by the subtraction of prayers and ceremonies in previous use. Prayers and ceremonies which gave explicit sacerdotal signification to the indeterminate formula specified by Pius XII as the essential form. This formula does indeed state that the candidates for ordination are to be elevated to the priesthood, but so does the Anglican. Within the context of the traditional Roman pontifical, there was not the least suspicion of ambiguity. Within the new rite, there most certainly is. So even if the new ordinal, that's the ceremony for the ordination of priest, if this new ordinal of Paul VI has exactly the same essential matter and form as the traditional rite, this in itself does not necessarily suffice to guarantee the validity of the rite, since the form of the traditional rite for the ordination of the priesthood is not really explicit enough to express precisely, all alone, by itself, the power that is given. Now, since the sacraments have their efficacy precisely by their signification, if a rite does not signify what it is supposed to affect, then it doesn't affect it. So in the case where, as in the ordination to the priesthood, the form does not sufficiently express the power the sacrament confers, the necessary signification must be found in other parts of the rite, so that the words of the form receive the required signification from the fact that they are found in the context of this rite, which does contain this signification. This is what theologians call significatio ex adjunctis, signification by means of things that are added. Father Francis Clark, an expert in the field, explains this vitally important point very clearly. He writes, "The sacramental signification of an ordination rite is not necessarily limited to one phrase or formula that can be clearly conveyed from many parts of the rite, but can be clearly conveyed from many parts of the rite. These other parts could thus contribute, either individually or in combination, to determining the sacramental meaning of the operative formula in an unambiguous sense. Thus, the wording of an ordination form, even if not specifically determinate in itself, can be given the required determination from its setting, ex adjunctis, that is, from the other prayers and actions of the rite, or even from the connotation of the ceremony as a whole in the religious context of the age." End of quote. Now, this is precisely the problem with the new ordinal of Paul VI. Although it contains the same form as a traditional rite, except for a few words which don't really have any importance, the rest of the rite is very different, especially by the fact that it has eliminated other important ceremonies which provided the signification ex adjunctis of the powers given by the sacrament. Michael Davies explains, "In the new ordinal, promulgated by Paul VI, every prayer in the traditional rite, which stated specifically the essential role of a priest as a man ordained to offer propitiatory sacrifice for the living and dead, has been removed. In most cases, these were the precise prayers removed by the Protestant reformers. None of the prayers which have been omitted from the traditional rite pertain to the substance of the sacrament or could be designated as essential to its validity. But nonetheless, their omission by the Protestant reformers was taken by Pope Leo XIII as an indication of an intention not to consecrate sacrificing priests. Now, the reference to Leo XIII, here is with regard to the bull Apostolicae Curae, written in 1896, in which he declared Anglican orders to be absolutely null and utterly void. So Mr. Davies goes on. Perhaps the most astonishing omission is that of the prayer accompanying the tradition of the chalice and the paten, the Accipe Potestatem prayer, which says, receive the power to offer sacrifice to God and to celebrate Mass both for the living and the dead in the name of the Lord. In view of the signification attached to this prayer during the Reformation controversies, its omission from the new rite can only be understood by Protestants as a retreat from the fullness of Catholic Eucharistic teaching, and it has been seen as such. This correspondence with the Anglican ordinal, and even though it's not complete, for Michael Davies adds that not every prayer in the New Catholic ordinal is acceptable to Protestants, and that it's rather a matter of what he terms a convergence rather than an identity of doctrine. But this convergence is disturbing, he says, because it is precisely this absence of expression of Catholic doctrine which led Leo XIII to declare the nullity of the Anglican ordinal, even if it were used by a bishop who was validly consecrated. Because in fact, some high church Anglicans were having themselves ordained by schismatic Orthodox bishops who were validly consecrated. Michael Davies quotes Leo XIII, who writes, from them, that is, from the prayers of the Anglican ordinal, has been deliberately removed whatever sets forth the dignity and the office of the priesthood in the Catholic rite. That form, consequently, cannot be considered apt or sufficient for the sacrament, which omits what it ought essentially to signify. And Michael Davies points out that this is precisely the case with the New Catholic ordinal. He writes, the problem which the new ordination rite poses faithful Catholics is that it does not contain a single mandatory prayer signifying that the grace and power of the priesthood is chiefly the power of consecrating and offering the true body and blood of the Lord. And these last words are a quote, in fact, from the Council of Trent, which says that's what ordination does. It gives this power of consecrating and offering the true body and blood of the Lord, which the new ordination rite doesn't express. So Michael Davies concludes his treatment of this grave question with a challenge. As a final comment on the New Catholic ordinal, I would like to quote a passage from Apostolicae Curae and to ask any reader to demonstrate to me how the words which Pope Leo XIII wrote of Cranmer's rite cannot be said to apply to the New Catholic ordinal, at least where mandatory prayers are concerned. And he quotes Leo XIII. Being fully cognizant of the necessary connection between faith and worship, between the law of believing and the law of praying, under a pretext of returning to the primitive form, they corrupted the liturgical order in many ways to suit the errors of the reformers. For this reason, in the whole ordinal, not only is there no clear mention of the sacrifice of consecration, of the sacerdotium, and of the power of consecrating and offering sacrifice, but as we have just stated, every trace of these things which had been in these such prayers as the Catholic rite, as they had not entirely rejected, was deliberately removed and struck out. In this way, the native character or spirit of the ordinal, as it is called, clearly manifests itself. Michael Davies, especially in a later edition of his book, resolutely came down on the side of the validity of this New Catholic ordinal, in spite of its failure to express sufficiently the power it confers, because of the simple fact that it was promulgated by the Pope and accepted by the whole Church. The weakness of this argument did not fail to escape the notice of Dr. Rama Kumaraswamy, a Sedevacantist writer, in his treatment of the question, where he turns the argument around against its author. He writes, Michael Davies believes that the strongest and perhaps only argument in favor of the validity of the new ordinal is that it was promulgated by a valid pope, Paul VI. While the principle that a valid pope cannot promulgate an invalid sacrament is correct, Michael Davies seems oblivious to the possibility that his argument can be inverted. If the rite is shown to be invalid, or for that matter, even doubtful, one is forced to question the legitimacy of the Pope. End of quote. Now we'll discuss this in a moment, but for now, we can answer the challenge Mr. Davies proposes and say that the words of Leo XIII, which he quotes with regard to the Anglican ordinal, cannot be applied in exactly the same sense to the new Catholic ordinal. For in the context of the Anglican ordinal, the words of the form don't give the form validity, even if pronounced by a valid minister, and even if they would suffice for the validity of Catholic rite, because that ordinal intentionally reputed the Catholic doctrine of the priesthood. That is its native character or spirit, or its animus, as Leo XIII calls it, which gives an heretical sense to the words of the form. Paul VI ordinal, however, cannot be said to have the intention to repudiate this doctrine, even if it doesn't express it. Its intention is not heretical, but rather ecumenical. That is, it doesn't intend to deny Catholic doctrine, as the Anglican ordinal did, but rather simply not to express it, for fear of being a stumbling block to our separated brethren, to use a celebrated phrase of Father Annibale Bunini with regard to the Novus Ordo Missae. Thus, Paul VI ordinal is valid, or at least can be valid, but it's bad because it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, namely express the Catholic faith. However, as we mentioned, there is one last problem with the new ordinal, and it's not a small one, namely its new rite for a consecration of a bishop, or rather ordination of a bishop, as the new ordinal itself calls it. We find here the same general problem as in the rite of the ordination of a priest, in that many of the ceremonies have been changed in such a way that the effect of the sacrament is not so clearly signified. In particular, the new conciliar doctrine of collegiality is expressed in various ways, and the essential sacramental power of ordaining priests also is somewhat obscured by the desire to show the bishop as a preacher of the Word of God, a concept designed, obviously, again, to please the Protestants. The major problem, however, is much graver, for in this rite of consecration of bishops, the form itself has been completely changed and seems to have no resemblance at all to the previous form, which had been solemnly defined by Pope Pius XII in 1947 as being the necessary and sufficient formula for the consecration of bishops. So the form has been completely changed. Now, this leads some to assert that the new rite of consecration is invalid, as does, for example, Dr. Kumaraswamy, who writes, "The new rite of Paul VI must logically be subject to the same condemnations that Leo XIII promulgated against Anglican orders. In fact, there is not one statement in the above quotations from his apostolic bull, the quotes that we mentioned, which cannot be applied to it. If one adds to this the abrogation of the traditional form, as specified by Pius XII's ex-cathedral pronouncement, and the change in the substance or meaning of the essential words specified as its replacement, we are left with the unfortunate conclusion that the bishops ordained by the new rite may be in no way different from their Lutheran and Anglican counterparts, that is, not bishops at all." End of quote. To begin our response to this difficult question, we must first clear up a misunderstanding that clouds the issue, an issue that's already clouded by itself enough. namely the idea that since the form of the new rite is completely different from that specified by Pius XII, that it is an abrogation of the traditional form as specified by Pius XII's ex-cathedral pronouncement, as Dr. Kurmaswamy puts it. But in fact, Paul VI had no intention to abrogate the form of Pius XII, as if saying, well, this form is no longer valid, as if he was somehow declaring that Pius XII was wrong and that he wanted to completely to say that, well, this form of his is no longer valid. He simply decided to add a new form, to make a new form for the consecration of a bishop, and to make this the form that would be used in the new Reformed Latin Rite, in the same way as he made a new order for the Mass. He didn't abrogate the former ceremony, it simply replaced it. But he wasn't saying that it wasn't valid anymore. Now, this confusion is linked with another one, namely that because the new form is so completely different from the former one, that it must necessarily be invalid. Now, there would certainly be a reason to worry if the new form was completely different from every form used by the Church for the consecration of bishops. But we're going to see that that is not the case. To understand this point, we must recall an important distinction in sacramental theology between the sacramental forms, which have been instituted by Christ himself, as for example the Eucharist, where the form is, this is my body, and this is the chalice of my blood, which form came from our Lord himself, and those sacraments which our Lord left to the discretion of the Church to give the forms. In the case of the latter sacraments, the Church has the power to determine the precise words that will be used to signify and effect the grace of the sacrament instituted by Christ. Now, it's obvious that the sacrament of order belongs to the second category, because the form used in it varies greatly in the different rites recognized as valid by the Church. Thus, the simple fact that the new form of the rite for the consecration of bishop differs from the former one is no proof at all that it is invalid, especially if it has been used by another rite recognized by the Church as valid. Now, this is, in fact, the case. Dom Bernard Bott, the Benedictine liturgist, who was the expert primarily responsible for the creation of this new rite for the consecration of bishops, explains its genesis in a text that shows, on the one hand, a very cavalier attitude towards and even a strange aversion to the traditional rite, and yet at the same time his reticence to invent something entirely new. He writes, "The Roman formula for the consecration of bishops is of a poverty of thought that contrasts with the sumptuousness of the form. Everyone is in agreement in finding that it only gives a very imperfect idea of the theology of the episcopacy." Now, this is quite a statement when you consider that this form was used for centuries by the Catholic Church to consecrate bishops. But we'll leave to Dom Bott the responsibility of his statement. But he goes on. "Consequently, the question arose, can we rework it, add to it, or replace it with another formula? I could hardly see any way of reworking it. Have a new formula composed by theologians? May God preserve us. I refuse to do it, and I do not believe anyone is capable of doing it. Therefore, but one solution remained: look for a replacement in the Eastern tradition." And so he goes on to explain where he found this replacement. "One fact impressed me. For the consecration of the patriarch and the patriarchates of both Antioch and Alexandria, we find two related formulas, which are revisions of the pair of Hippolytus." Now, Hippolytus That's a long story about Hippolytus. He was anti-pope, in fact, who had reconciled to the church just before he was martyred. Um, but we have some texts of his, very ancient texts of liturgy from Hippolytus. In fact, that's where the second Eucharistic prayer in the New Mass comes from, is one of these prayers of Hippolytus. But anyway, this is one of his prayers, is also at the origin of these consecration rites in the patriarchates of both Antioch and Alexandria. So Dom Bott goes on. Whoever the author may be, because there is dispute about, these texts of Hippolytus, are they really Hippolytus and exactly where they come from? But he says that doesn't matter. Whoever the author may be, this is a fact of tradition that these prayers, this prayer of Hippolytus, was at the basis of the rite of consecration for patriarchs in Antioch and Alexandria. He goes on. For centuries, these prayers have been in usage in these two patriarchies and give the episcopacy an infinitely richer version than the Roman prayers. Would this not be an opportunity, since it is necessary to change, to get closer to the Eastern tradition? As you see, it is not a concern for antiquarianism that has guided me, but a concern for ecumenism. Our guarantee is that this prayer inspired two great Eastern patriarchs. Now, one can certainly deplore that the new rite of consecration of bishops in the Catholic Church was written by someone with such a contemptuous attitude towards tradition, and that he based his decision on a concern for ecumenism. But that certainly does not affect the validity of the rite. The fact that it's substantially the same rite as that used for centuries by the patriarchs of Antioch, where St. Peter had been bishop at one point, and Alexandria, where his disciple St. Mark became bishop, largely suffices to guarantee its validity. We can mention one last time the good Dr. Kumaraswamy, because a number of internauts still seem to follow his attempted demonstration of the invalidity of the new rite. One of his main arguments is a comparison between the Antiochian Syrian rite, for the consecration of a bishop, and the new rite of Paul VI, which shows that the two have practically nothing in common. And so, says Dr. Kumaraswamy, the pretension of Dom Bott to have used this approved rite of Antioch to make his new rite simply wasn't true, because he compared the two and he found that they had practically nothing to do with each other. Now, the only problem with this demonstration of Dr. Kumaraswamy is that the Antiochian rite that he used for his comparison is not the rite that Dom Bott used, but another one that is not for the consecration of a patriarch, but that of a simple bishop, whereas Dom Bott used the rite for the consecration of a patriarch, which is not the same. And at that time, the patriarch, when someone was consecrated patriarch, he was not a bishop before that. So this rite that they used actually made the person who was consecrated a bishop. Also, Dr. Kumaraswamy didn't even bother to look at the Coptic rite used in Alexandria, which also corresponds to this new rite of Dom Bott. So, these objections raised, especially by Sedevacantists, against the validity of the new rites of the coordination of priests and bishops are thus refuted. However, this does not mean that the new rite is necessarily always valid in every particular case, or even that the Church might one day declare that it was invalid per se, as Leo XIII did with regard to the Anglican ordinal. In particular cases, there may be reasons to doubt the validity of these ordinations and consecrations. For example, if the translations transform their meaning, or if in some other way, either by omission or addition, an intention is expressed which is contrary to what the Church intends. Each case must be judged on its own merits, and in practice, it is often necessary to act as if certain ordinations were not valid, because the principle with sacraments is that one must be morally sure of their validity. And so if there is any positive doubt about it, the sacraments should be conferred again under condition, which is, in fact, what is often done in most cases in traditional circles. Furthermore, one cannot even rule out the possibility that one day the Church would decree that this new ordinal was invalid in itself. We have simply shown the arguments by which the Sedevacantists attempt to prove the invalidity of the new rite, and we've shown that those arguments do not prove that invalidity. That does not preclude the possibility that there might be other reasons why it is invalid. True, it seems difficult to understand how God would allow practically the whole church to be without priests and bishops for decades, at least the Western Church. And that does constitute an a priori argument in favor of the validity of the new rite. But in the end, it is not something that our reason can judge, because it's a supernatural truth that pertains to the mystery of the sacraments. So it's the Church herself alone who can judge in such matters by a solemn decree that will put an end to all discussion. Until that happens, and it might be a long time from now, our part is simply to hold to what is true and has always been recognized as true, and to go on and reject the novelties which contradict previous church teaching. And yet we must not go farther and have the pretense to make judgments about things that it does not belong to us to judge. Practically, we must go on as if, as we said, often we must act as if these ordinations and consecrations were doubtful, but we cannot pronounce absolutely their invalidity because it doesn't belong to us to do that. It's only the Church that can do that. To do that would be neither prudent nor reasonable, and it's not at all necessary. I thank you for your attention.